Understanding color theory is a really simple way of making basic scenes look more interesting and exciting. You can draw the viewer's eye to certain areas and pull them away from others. That's not only helpful for artists in general, but it goes beyond this. You can be a level designer and want to pull the characters in a certain direction, and you can use good color theory and color combinations to help that happen. The same is true if you want a certain aspect of a character to stand out, and you're a character designer. Using the right colors can make certain items of that character really pop. So let's take a look. Let's start by talking about a few terms that you'll come across when looking at color theory. First of all, I've got a monkey in the scene. It's sitting on a grey plane, and you can see it's a mid-grey just here. And I've got a very grey coloured HDRI in the background. It's important to note that the colour of the HDRI will have an influence on the colour of your objects. So if this was a very reddy HDRI, you'd get more red within your objects in the scene. Also, adjacent objects, so this plane, for example, next to the monkey, if I change this colour to something like red, you'll see red on the monkey. So adjacent objects and their colours will influence the objects around them. So I'll just change this back to grey so it's nice and neutral, and I can do that with the saturation. That will bring my point back into the middle there. So I'll click on the monkey and let's talk a little bit more about that color wheel. So if I click on my color now, we get the color wheel coming up and the hue, saturation, and value underneath it. However, if I zoom in a bit, I'll bring this down and click on it again, it makes a bigger box. That's useful to know in case you want to be a bit more precise picking your colors. So obviously I can use the color wheel to pick colors like this, and you can see it changes the hue, saturation, and value at the bottom. You have got an option of RGB here, which is red, green, and blue, but that can be quite unintuitive to find the right color unless you have specific values. So hue, saturation, and value is probably an easier way to pick colors. So as I've pointed out, the saturation, if I bring that up to 1, that will come out to the edge of the circle, and we've got a nice saturated color just there. And if I change the hue now, that will go around the circle. So the hue indicates the actual type of color. If I bring the saturation down to 0 and change the hue, nothing will happen because there is no saturation and therefore none of this hue coming through. So I'll bring that back up to 1, and we've got this lovely turquoisey color just here. The last one in the list is value, and you can see that's the slider down the side here, and it's affecting the slider just here. They're the same, and that's what most people would call the brightness, so how bright your color is. It's interesting that when you bring the value down, you tend to get what looks to be more saturated colors. If I bring the value up, it can give the illusion that it's not as saturated. So that's worth bearing in mind. A lower value on your object's color can give a more saturated feel. You've also got the alpha here. That's not particularly important for this lecture, but that's the transparency. So that's the terminology we use. And it's worth pointing out as well that the roughness will also have quite an effect on the appearance of the color. If I make this less rough, so nice and shiny, you'll start to see more reflections and therefore more influence of the background on our color, more roughness, and we see quite a nice blue color closer to what we see up here because we haven't got the influence of the surrounding objects. This is one reason I tend to use really high roughness values when I'm doing low poly modeling. It not only gives a softer feel, but I feel like I can work with the colors in a much more effective way. So that's the basic terminology. So the next stage is starting to think about how we can make things look amazing by using color. And there's certain color combinations that seem to work really well. Here's an example from Nada Cruz, perhaps is how you pronounce that. I'm not really sure, but this is where I've got this from. And you can just search on sites like Pinterest or Google for color theory and color combinations to get similar charts to this, but this seemed to be a really nice one to use. And you can see the way they've combined colors, so monochromatic being completely on its own, complementary being across the color wheel like this, triadic in a triangle, rectangular and tetradic. Again, self-explanatory there. Analogous colors are right next to each other, and then you've got analogous complementary next to each other, and then using the opposite, and then split complementary. Again, this idea of opposites but slightly apart on the other side. Let's go through some of those and see how they're effective and how they work. So here's an example of monochromatic. It's surprisingly effective at showing off the shape, and we don't particularly focus on any one object, except if you change the value. So you can see the monkey here, the value is up at the top here, whereas the other objects are all the same and their value is much lower down. So even with monochromatic, you can change the value to make things stand out. You could also change the saturation, but that does kind of change the color more and therefore we're coming away a bit from the monochromatic idea. But it's often the case that we want to highlight one area and draw the eye, which if I select the monkey and the cylinder, link the materials and turn off the overlays, you can see that nothing really stands out. But as soon as I undo that, changing the value can make things pop. So that's how we can use monochromatic, yet still draw the eye to a certain area. And this is commonly what you're trying to do as an artist. You're trying to lead people into a certain area of your painting, or let's say you're a level designer. You want to lead the eye to certain areas where you want the character to go, or objects you want them to pick up. So let's take a look at complementary. We can see up the top here that it's opposites. So I've got a sort of more browny color over here and the opposite being the blue. And you can really see now that monkey standing out an awful lot against this monochromatic background with the other colors. So just because you've got colors on the opposite side of the color wheel doesn't necessarily mean that you have to even it out and have as many blue as many reddy orangey. You can just use that complementary color on the opposite side as a one-off to really pull people into that area. This is a really go-to one for most artists, this idea of complementary, and that's why you see the idea of analogous complementary there and split complementary as well. There's sort of variations on this idea of making things pop by using the opposites. Let's take a quick look at triadic. So that's the one at the top corner here. And I've got very similar colors with the red, yellow, and the blue, which you can see in the scene. And again, I've got two objects that stand out. The rest are monochrome. And it's often the case that you don't want to just lead the eye into one position. You might need to lead it one place and then another afterwards. In this case, it would work quite well if we select these ones and link the colors together here. Our eyes will tend to look for that individual color here and then go across to these ones second, because they also stand out against the mainly red color we've got in the entire scene. So you can manipulate people and give them an order in the way they look using colors. And again, we can also use the value to increase the brightness of a certain object to make it stand out more. Rectangular and tetradic are kind of similar effects in a way. I find they can get a little bit busy, but again, if you had lots of objects in the scene, you can help people to look in different areas using the same technique. Let's take a look at analogous now. You can see that they're colors that are right next to each other in the color wheel. It still works really nicely. It's kind of similar to monochromatic, but it's a little bit more varied. And as always, you can select on an object, increase its brightness, and it will stand out against the others. This one's kind of an interesting one with the blue. You'll probably notice how it looks a little bit darker than some of the other ones we've looked at. Interestingly, blue is kind of naturally darker looking than yellow. The colors on this side of the color wheel tend to be called cool colors, and they tend to be called warm on this side. Blue can be really effective used as a nighttime light, because often we still want to brighten up our scenes and be able to make things visible, but lots of beginners make the mistake of making their backgrounds completely black. Whilst that's true, it can be really helpful just to use blue instead so that you can actually see the objects, but it still gives that dark feeling. So hopefully that's given you some sort of practical guide as to how these different color combinations can work. The last thing I want to point out is that there's lots of options that you can choose from. A good site for exploring these types of things is Adobe Color. You can see under the Create option, it's got the color harmony, or the color combinations as we've been calling them just here, and we can then choose palettes based on that harmony. What's useful about this is you can pull this circle around and you can adapt the different colors within the wheel based on saturation and come up with lots of different variations. And it's nice that it actually has the options of changing the saturation as well, not just going for the complete opposites. And you'll notice that when you press on these things, it does actually have a different value. And you can adapt these things as you see fit, use the color picker to pick out colors and adapt your palette at the bottom here accordingly. It's got tools as well to extract a theme, and you can drag and drop a picture into here and get a color palette from that. There is a function within Blender to do that as well, but this is just as nice. There's also options where you can just explore different color palettes, as you can see here. And it's quite handy because it's got pictures to go with it, so you can see the effects of that color palette in an actual scene. You've also got things like libraries and trends where you can just go in and pick color palettes as well. Now there's no hard and fast rules as to how you use color. And again, it's often that classic thing of breaking the rules in order to come up with something a bit more original. But as a beginner, I would certainly recommend sticking to these color combinations. It makes things quite simple because they're often quite simple ways to use color, but very effective. So hopefully that's helped you with your color combinations and given you a bit more knowledge about color theory. If you like this style of teaching, then do check out the links in the description for more great content. If you've got any questions, then do leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.